In this lesson, we'll continue our discussion of the urinary system by taking a look at the blood flow within the kidney. There's both arteries and veins. So if you think about it, one of the major functions of the kidney is to filter the blood. So there is an abundance of blood in the kidney at any time. So let's start with the first artery that's going to bring blood into the kidney, and that's going to be the renal arteries. They come off of the abdominal aorta. In subsequent or in previous lessons, when we studied the circulatory system, we saw the renal arteries coming right off the aorta and going directly into the kidney. Now, once the renal artery right here, this big blood vessel, right? The aorta would be running straight up and down this way. Once the renal artery enters the kidney, it's going to divide into some branches. We're going to call these branches right here, right? This would be another one over here. This would be called the segmental arteries, right? They're going to branch off of the renal arteries. The segmental arteries, they then branch off. So you say, oh, follow this one from here, right? These branch, and they're going to go into this area here. This is known as the interlobar artery, right? So this one here would be an interlobar. This guy over here, all of these that are kind of running up through the columns. If you remember again from a previous lesson, we had talked about a renal lobe. This is kind of running through the renal lobe, hence the name. Okay, so renal artery to the segmental arteries. Once the segmental arteries they divide, they're going to divide into interlobar, right? Inter means between the lobes. Right, so before I go back to the notes, the next thing that's going to happen here is the interlobar artery is going to become another artery that's going to cover the base of the pyramid over here. See how it arcs around, right? It arches around. So they call these here, like all these here, this red one here, kind of arching over the pyramid. We call these the arcuate arteries, and there's arcuate veins. We'll talk about that in a minute. Right now we're talking about the arterial blood flow in. Okay, so one more time the progression. Renal artery, segmental arteries. They divide into the interlobar arteries. Here's one. Then it's going to arch, right, arc around over the pyramid. This is the arcuate artery. And then from there, these arteries here are going to radiate up, almost like radiations, right? They're going to go up. Those are going to be called, watch this, the cortical radiate arteries. Cortical means they're in the cortex, and they, to the anatomists, they look like they were radiations. It's just kind of like these fibers going up, so they call them radiate arteries. And right next to it are the veins. We'll talk about those. We'll talk about those in a minute. So here's kind of a blow up of. Here's a renal pyramid. So this would be like here, the interlobar artery, arcuate artery right there. See how it arches over the base of the pyramid, and then these here, one, two, third one here, there's another fourth one here. And all these lines going up are the cortical radiate arteries. Okay, and I have the arcuate label for you, and then the interlobar label for you also. All right, so that's an important progression you need to know. Renal arteries become segmental. Segmental further branch into interlobar. Then the interlobars arch over the base of the pyramid, and then from the arcuate arteries we're going to have all these little radiations known as the cortical radiate arteries, and they're going to bring the blood up to the nephron, which is the filtering unit. I put here in parentheses because I do hear people sometimes use this term. Another term for the cortical radiate arteries are interlobular arteries. So instead of calling these red lines cortical radiate, you could call them interlobular. Right? That would be okay also. Okay, so again, this is just a blow up of this region right over here so we could see those cortical radiates. Okay, so From the cortical radiate artery, the next progression is this. There's going to be a blood vessel that comes off the cortical radiate artery that's going to bring blood into the nephron. That blood vessel is known as the afferent arteriole. Right? It emerges from the cortical radiate arteries and it enters the glomerulus. This is actually part of the nephron. Once the blood is brought into the glomerulus, it's then going to leave the glomerulus via the efferent arteriole. Right? You can always think of afferent as going into something. So in this case, it's going into the glomerulus. And think of efferent as leaving something. So it's leaving the glomerulus. All right, so we'll see if you can follow me on this. Here's the um, cortical radiate artery here. This blue thing we're going to study in a different lesson. This is going to be the nephron. The afferent arteriole would come off, go into the little round dot right there above my arrow. That's the glomerulus. Right there, and then an efferent arteriole will come out. We'll look at that in more detail in another lesson. So for now, just know that the afferent arteriole is bringing blood into the nephron, and then the efferent arteriole is bringing the blood out of the nephron. Okay, so we can show you that blow up a little bit. Again, just here's the cortical radiate artery, and then the blood vessel going off of it into this little round red dot right there. That's the glomerulus. So they're showing on this picture the afferent arterioles, right? So here would be an afferent arteriole. Here's an afferent arteriole. The round area is going to be the glomerulus of the nephron. Right? Again, we're going to get there in a second. Okay, so watch this. What they're not showing you on this picture is where my cursor is going up, my pointer. This is where the cortical radiate artery would be. Now, the blood vessel coming off the cortical radiate artery is the afferent arteriole. It's going to go into this network of capillaries here. This is called the glomerulus, and then the blood is going to leave through the efferent arteriole. We don't see it too well in this picture, but this will help you in the lab when you look at the models. The afferent arteriole is always wider than the efferent arteriole. This is going to be more narrow. That'll help you to identify them. So the afferent arteriole comes off of the cortical radiate artery, brings the blood into the glomerulus, and then the blood leaves the glomerulus through the efferent arteriole. This is where blood is going to start to be filtered. We'll get into that in a subsequent lesson. Before I go back to the notes. Now, the efferent arteriole is going to now turn into a bunch of capillaries, all these red blood vessels here that go around the blue tubes here. These blue tubes or purplish tubes are the nephron. So these are the tubes of the nephron. So they call these blood vessels here the Peri tubular capillaries. Peri means around the tubes. Okay. And you'll see functionally that this is important when you study how urine is made. Once all the blood leaves this peritubular capillaries, they're now going to start to bring the blood into the veins, and these venules here are going to leave the kidney, and I'll show you that in a second. All right, so what's important right now up here is this. The afferent arteriole comes off of the cortical radiate artery, brings the blood into the glomerulus. From here, the blood leaves the glomerulus through the efferent arteriole. Then the efferent arteriole is going to branch into this whole network of capillaries. All these red tubes here are going to be called the peritubular capillaries, and then that will start to lead to the venous side, where we're going to take the blood that's now been filtered out of the kidney. So this kidney nephron here is actually a type of nephron called a cortical nephron. It's just the position of the nephron. I'll go over that in a subsequent lesson. Here's another type of nephron called the juxtamedullary nephron. It's just a longer nephron. Its position is a little bit different. So you can see here, here's the afferent arteriole going into the glomerulus, and then the efferent arteriole coming out. right? And then we would have these peritubular capillaries, which extend way down into the renal medulla. Again, we'll cover this in a subsequent lesson. And then we change the name of these capillaries into the vasa recta, and they're going to lead to the venule system. All right, so I'll save this for a subsequent lesson. Okay, so once the blood has gone through the glomerulus and gone through the peritubular capillaries, we're now going to be on the venous side. So we're going to end up getting arcuate veins, which become interlobar veins. Now notice there's no segmental veins. Some books say there are, some books say there aren't. We're going to say there's no segmental veins. That's going to then lead to the renal vein, which is now going to bring the blood to the inferior vena cava. So what are we talking about? So from where the nephron is up in here, let's say, the blood is going to go into the cortical radiate vein. That would be like this blue line going up and down here. That's going to lead to the arcuate vein. The arcuate vein is going to bring the blood down into the interlobar vein. Now the interlobar veins, they all unite and go directly into the renal vein. Again, most textbooks say there are no segmental veins. There are some textbooks that do that. We're going to say there's not. Again, here's just showing the veins, right? Cortical radiate vein to the arcuate vein to the interlobar vein, and then again these interlobar veins are going to go to the they're going to go to the renal artery. Here's actually a picture showing segmental veins. Again, there's a lot of controversy with that. You can just ignore that. We're going to say there are no segmental veins. All right, and then here's the last slide, just kind of showing the progression of the blood into and then out of the kidney, right? So from the renal artery, we're going to say that's coming off of the abdominal aorta. It's going to bring the blood into the kidney. They're going to branch into the segmental arteries. They branch into the interlobar arteries. They then arch around over the pyramid. They become the arcuate arteries. And from there they radiate up. You're going to call those the cortical radiate arteries, or if you like, interlobular arteries. They're going to give off little blood vessels that are going to go into the nephron now. This is going to be the afferent arteriole, right? This is going to be the bigger of the blood vessels bringing blood into the glomerulus. At the glomerulus, we're going to get some filtering taking place, and then the blood's going to leave through the efferent arteriole. Right? This is going to be more narrow compared to the afferent arteriole. Again, that'll help you to find them on the models. Then the efferent arteriole, they're going to form this network of capillaries that go around all of the tubes of the nephron. And then eventually that blood is going to go into small venules, which become cortical radiate veins. Now we're going to flow the blood back out of the kidney. Those are going to become arcuate veins, and then they're going to become interlobar veins. Again, we're going to say there's no segmental veins. All right, so depending on what lab manual you're using, you may have it in your pictures, you may not. And it's a little bit confusing even for me. And then you're going to get the renal vein, which goes into the inferior vena cava. So I kind of like this flow chart because it's showing you, everything's equal. You have interlobular arteries, interlobar arteries, interlobar veins, arcuate arteries, arcuate veins, cortical radiate arteries, cortical radiate veins. So just kind of giving you that progression. Okay, so that concludes this lesson of the blood flow, right? You should be able to trace a drop of blood from the abdominal aorta through the entire kidney and then out to the inferior vena cava.